Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-o-matic presentation and recording for the part of the lesson that has looking at fact, opinion, and bias. It's not as easy as you think. For this particular part of the lesson, your task here is to complete the chart notes that coincide with this presentation. Please also remember that at the end that you have to complete a series of exercises on the different forms of bias. Please additionally remember that you can replay any part of this presentation that you need for detail or clarity later on, and/or repetition. Let's go ahead and get started. Understanding whether or not your information is fact or opinion is actually more important than what you might know, especially when it comes to being an informed citizen of the United States. The problem is that factual information and opinions are often mixed together, especially when getting the news. This makes it even more difficult to separate one from the other. The whole task for today's lesson is to try to do just that. Here's a little bit of background information that might help. What is a fact? Well, a fact is something that actually exists or that had happened. It can be verifiable, can be confirmed with other sources or replicated, and if it is verified, it includes eyewitness accounts, experiences, raw data, facts, statistics, and more. So understanding this, of course, can help you look at the news with more objectivity. Additionally, what's an opinion? An individual interpretation or feeling about factual information. So be aware for phrases like a personal preference, like I like, or I think, or I prefer. Another thing you should be aware of is some opinions are more informed than others. However, despite this different tiered approach, opinions are still opinions. What is bias? So having an inclination to interpret facts in a certain way is in fact a broad-based definition of what bias is. Preferring one interpretation of facts over another is also bias, and sometimes this includes not knowing, not including, or not considering other facts that could change the interpretation. Another thing for you guys to consider here is that there's fundamental differences between facts and opinions that might be more obvious when you read the news. Facts are accepted as true, like the earth rotates around the sun, we know this, and it can be verified or replicated by multiple different sources, and you would find the same thing to be reported in different entities. It is a first-hand account from a credible eyewitness. Often with history, primary sources can be really helpful with this too. The same thing might apply to journalism. Now, in terms of opinion over here, other interpretations or feelings about the topic are in fact possible, especially when you look at a broad range of spectrum of opinions. It cannot be proven with complete certainty, and it is a personal preference or taste, and it is based on second-hand information or hearsay. So in many ways, this whole notion of opinion reporting can sometimes get in the way of finding the real deal of a story. Please be aware of these. When it comes to data, just because an opinion is based on numbers or graphs doesn't mean that it is a fact. Data can be misleading for various reasons. Same thing could be said true with photos and video. Just because there's a photo or video of something doesn't mean it is a fact, because these can be easily manipulated with editing, especially in today's day and age. And let's talk about experts for a moment. Just because someone is an expert in the field doesn't mean that his or her interpretations are in fact. Experts have biases too. Every person does. Some other things to consider is it's important for us to detect bias by looking for the following phenomenon. In terms of background, if you're not familiar with the source, find maybe an about page of an organization, and authors will often reveal their own biases ahead of time. If you can't find an about page, search the organization or author to see what ideas they are connected with. Additionally, in terms of money, if the site, organization, or author is selling something, chances are they will have a bias toward their product and the facts and opinions that support it too. Sources often have a bias toward the organizations that fund them. And let's talk for a moment about language. Be aware of words or phrases that are opinionated mixed with facts. Be aware of connotative words or phrases that convey a positive or negative image too. Be aware of tone, and is the tone neutral and serious, or is it sarcastic and or even more? Tone can also make or break a story. Another thing to consider in terms of detecting bias is really thinking about this question. In a secondary news source, like a newspaper website, what might you find? Well, in terms of fact, in the hard news section, the front page and sections of a newspaper homepage of a website could be factual. In other hard news sections, which may be called national news, local news, etc., you might find more fact-based interpretations. At the beginning of the broadcast news shows too, you might find facts as well. In terms of opinion, in an opinion or editorial section or tab clearly labeled as such, you would definitely find that. In other sections, but also clearly labeled as column with a byline and photo, review, analysis, or commentary, you might find opinion news. In terms of soft news or human interest stories, and some sports stories allow for some opinion as well. In terms of bias, in opinion stories, editorials, columns, reviews, analyses, and commentaries, this is obvious and ethical. Anywhere else too, you would find bias. Subtle bias can come from word choice, what news a publication decides to focus on, or even where it is located. Ethical sources will try to reduce this as much as possible. Now let's go on to the last slide here. And before we dive right in, let me just preface this by saying that I think it's really important to understand the different forms of biases that exist in our world. Here are some of the major forms of biases that you might of course run into when it comes to being informed. Bias by omission. Up here at the top. This type of bias is used when a media source purposely leaves out information which supports or favors one party or viewpoint over another. This can occur with one particular story or over a period of time in multiple stories by a given source. Each media outlet typically favors either the liberal or conservative viewpoint and omits certain information accordingly. Bias by spin, down here at the bottom, is when a story features only one interpretation of a story, totally excluding the other. This is bias by spin. This can include suggestive or misleading photos, and obvious bias in the reporter or news source's tone, or anything else that misleads the story's audience altogether. Up here in the middle is bias by selection of sources. This occurs when a media outlet includes disproportionate amount of expert sources or witnesses for one party or viewpoint over another. So if a reporter or journalist interviews one conservative and four liberals for the same story, this is an example of bias by selection of sources. Now, if no experts are present, but the reporter does use phrases such as experts say, evidence suggests, in favor of one viewpoint, this too is also bias. Let's jump down here in the middle. Bias by labeling. So there are two forms for this type of bias. One involves using more extreme words to characterize one party over another. For example, using the word liberal with one party but using ultra-conservative with the other is clearly bias. And another type involves the media referring to a source as an expert or using another favorable term without identifying the individual as liberal or conservative. Now let's jump up here to the top right. Bias by placement, and this one's kind of obvious because it's in the name. But bias by placement occurs if a story or viewpoint which favors one agenda over another is given a more prominent location in a piece of media, or when within a story one viewpoint is mentioned much earlier than another. In a news story, both viewpoints are mentioned in roughly the same place. Down here at the bottom right, bias by story selection. When a media source presents an unbalanced number of stories which favor one party's viewpoint over another's, this is bias by selection. This type of bias also occurs when a media source ignores one party's take on a particular issue and shows only one side of the argument. So as you guys can see, bias, fact, and opinion are a little bit more complex than what you might have imagined. But regardless, it does help us to know about some of these things to be well-informed and well-adjusted citizens of the United States. In our democracy, remember, freedom is definitely a privilege, and it's also in many ways a right. But it is also up to us to identify the different fundamentals of getting effective news through effective means while considering fact, opinion, and bias. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good luck with completing the rest of the lesson.